Ukraine's war with Russia entered another tense and violent chapter this week as President Volodymyr Zelensky confirmed an upcoming meeting with US President Donald Trump in New York. The announcement came amid one of Russia's most devastating aerial attacks in months, a barrage of missiles and drones that left casualties, destruction, and a chilling reminder of the war's brutality. In a late-night address, Zelensky detailed the scale of the assault, while also previewing what he called critical talks on Ukraine's security guarantees at the United Nations General Assembly. His words reflected both urgency and defiance as his country absorbed yet another wave of violence while preparing for high-stakes diplomacy. According to Ukrainian officials, Russia launched one of its most aggressive bombardments in recent months. Zelensky, addressing his citizens, described a massive onslaught that battered cities and towns across Ukraine. Volodymyr Zelensky said Russia carried out one of its largest aerial attacks, firing 40 missiles and some 580 drones at Ukraine in a nighttime barrage that killed at least 3 people and wounded dozens. The attacks targeted energy infrastructure, residential neighborhoods, and critical defense positions, leaving emergency services scrambling through the night. Local authorities reported power outages in several regions, shattered apartment buildings, and civilians rushing to underground shelters as air raid sirens blared. Military analysts noted the use of drones in such high numbers reflects Moscow's increasing reliance on cheaper, more flexible aerial weapons. These so-called kamikaze drones can swarm targets and overwhelm air defenses, causing both physical and psychological damage. In a sign of Kyiv's continued ability to strike deep into Russian territory, Ukraine responded with its own attack. Regional officials in Russia confirmed that Ukrainian forces hit the southwestern Samara region. The local governor announced grim news. He said, "A Ukrainian strike killed 4 people in Russia's southwestern Samara region. This marked one of the deadliest Ukrainian strikes on Russian soil since the full-scale invasion began in February 2022. It underscored both the widening reach of Ukraine's military operations and the dangerous escalation cycle fueling the war. Moscow condemned the strike as terrorism, while Kyiv emphasized that it was acting within its right to defend itself and disrupt military operations staged from across the border. Even as his nation endured the assault, Zelensky turned attention to diplomacy. He confirmed that he would meet US President Donald Trump next week in New York on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly. Volodymyr Zelensky said, "I would meet US counterpart Donald Trump on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly next week as Russia intensified deadly strikes across my country." The meeting carries heavy symbolism. Trump's second presidency has reshaped Washington's approach to the conflict, and Zelensky has pressed hard for continued Western backing. Zelensky outlined his agenda for the talks. He said, "I would discuss security guarantees for Ukraine and sanctions on Russia during the talks with Trump in New York." For Ukraine, the concept of Western-backed security guarantees is seen as essential. Kyiv insists that without binding commitments from allies, the risk of renewed Russian aggression will remain, even if battlefield conditions shift. Ukraine's demand for security guarantees has been a point of debate among Western capitals. Some favor long-term military assistance packages modeled after US commitments to Israel, while others prefer a NATO pathway with phased conditions. Washington has so far maintained a cautious stance, offering large amounts of aid, but avoiding permanent troop deployments inside Ukraine. Zelensky, however, continues to argue that guarantees are not just about weapons, but about survival. Moscow, meanwhile, has reacted with fury to any suggestion of Western troops on Ukrainian soil. Russian President Vladimir Putin has repeatedly drawn a red line on this issue. Vladimir Putin has warned any Western troops in Ukraine would be unacceptable and legitimate targets. The warning highlights the delicate balance global leaders face: how to deter Russia without crossing thresholds that could escalate into a wider war. The backdrop for the Trump-Zelensky meeting is the United Nations General Assembly, a stage where the Ukraine war is expected to dominate discussions. Diplomats say Ukraine's case will be central to debates about international law, territorial integrity, and the limits of great power aggression. Zelensky's message will likely emphasize resilience and appeal for unity. The Ukrainian leader has consistently used global platforms to rally support, from parliaments in Europe to the US Congress and beyond. His speeches often blend moral urgency with blunt assessments of the battlefield. The meeting with Trump also reflects political realities. Trump, having returned to power, has reshaped US foreign policy with a stronger emphasis on American interests and a harder negotiating style with allies. Zelensky is keenly aware of these shifts and is expected to frame Ukraine's defense not only as a European security issue, but as an American strategic interest. While high-level diplomacy takes place abroad, civilians in Ukraine continue to bear the brunt of the conflict. The overnight strikes killed at least 3 people, wounded dozens, and displaced families from their homes. Local reports described harrowing scenes: emergency workers pulling survivors from rubble, parents shielding children in basements, and hospitals struggling to treat shrapnel wounds. For many Ukrainians, these attacks are not just headlines, but daily life, nights spent in fear, mornings marked by destruction. The psychological toll is immense. International humanitarian groups warn that prolonged displacement, trauma, and infrastructure collapse are creating a generation scarred by war. Analysts suggest Russia's decision to unleash 40 missiles and nearly 600 drones in a single night may reflect both desperation and calculation. Such attacks aim to exhaust Ukraine's air defenses, deplete Western-supplied munitions, and wear down civilian morale. However, the strategy carries risks for Moscow. Each strike fuels international outrage, tightens Western resolve, and justifies further military aid to Ukraine. The fact that Ukraine can strike back, as in Samara, also complicates Russia's narrative of being on the offensive. The upcoming Trump-Zelensky meeting will be closely scrutinized. Trump's previous comments on NATO funding, burden sharing, and Ukraine have raised questions about the durability of US support. Yet his administration has continued providing aid, albeit under different frameworks than his predecessors' policies. For Zelensky, face-to-face talks offer a chance to secure firm commitments, clarify US positions, and demonstrate unity against Russian aggression. His messaging will likely stress that Ukraine's struggle is not just local, but part of a broader defense of democratic values. Trump, meanwhile, is expected to highlight his administration's focus on results and accountability, pushing allies to contribute more. Whether this approach strengthens or complicates Ukraine's security guarantees remains to be seen. The Samara strike is a reminder that the war has consequences beyond Ukraine's borders. For Russia, civilian deaths at home challenge the Kremlin's narrative of control and fuel nationalist demands for harsher retaliation. For Europe, the continued fighting means prolonged energy insecurity, refugee flows, and political divisions. Countries like Poland, Germany, and France face mounting pressure to balance domestic priorities with commitments to Kyiv. At the UN, countries from the Global South may once again voice concerns about food security, energy costs, and the unequal attention given to Ukraine compared to other conflicts. Zelensky has often addressed these audiences directly, urging them to see Ukraine's cause as a universal fight against aggression. As Ukraine counts the cost of Russia's latest attacks and prepares for a pivotal week in New York, the stakes could not be higher. The meeting between Volodymyr Zelensky and Donald Trump symbolizes the intersection of war and diplomacy, a test of whether battlefield resilience can be matched by international guarantees. The voices of the leaders involved capture the urgency. Volodymyr Zelensky said, "Russia carried out one of its largest aerial attacks, firing 40 missiles and some 580 drones at Ukraine in a nighttime barrage that killed at least 3 people and wounded dozens." The local governor said, "A Ukrainian strike killed 4 people in Russia's southwestern Samara region." Volodymyr Zelensky said, "I would meet US counterpart Donald Trump on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly next week as Russia intensified deadly strikes across my country." Volodymyr Zelensky said, "I would discuss security guarantees for Ukraine and sanctions on Russia during the talks with Trump in New York." Vladimir Putin has warned, Any Western troops in Ukraine would be unacceptable and legitimate targets. These words frame the reality: a war still raging, diplomacy still unfolding, and a future still uncertain.